Hi, this is Paul. I want to touch on an article that David Fuller posted on Twitter a couple of days ago, and I saw it, first skimmed a little bit of it, thought, oh, that's good, and this morning sat down and read it a lot more carefully, and thought it touched on a lot of what I've been thinking about. I started this internet journey when I watched Jordan Peterson give some helpful language in some ways to trying to connect heaven and earth. And of course, he used Jung, who had, I think, developed some very interesting observations on the story inside and the story outside. In the modernist world, in a materialist frame, there's a great deal of skepticism about agents beyond us and above us, that human beings are the only agents out there. And if you look at the critique of modernistic celebrity atheists, the assertion is that, well, there's no God floating around up there in the sky. And again, remember, the conceptualization of God is a neo-pagan one, where there's basically a meta-divine realm, and that there are these other agents floating around up there who are influencing us. Flip Wilson, of course, said, "The devil made me do it." And to watch Sam Harris on stage with Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris expresses his skepticism that there is a God, there is an agent up there who influences us and who might have power over us, or there are demons out there who might tempt us and have power through us, that the only agents around are us, which is sort of ironic with Sam Harris because it's hard to know whether or not we're agents at all with him. Listen to his conversations with Brett Weinstein, where we just watch the movie because it's all set, and Sam Harris's sort of determinism. Jonathan Peugeot, of course, is something of a prophet with his capacity to read patterns and symbols, and working off the biblical text and the Christian tradition, has been making some prophecies about it getting rougher, and, well, it certainly has in 2020. The COVID-19, the George Floyd protests, the intensification of the bunch of the stuff that Jordan Peterson had been talking about, but it's obviously gone to whole new levels. And so this question of agency that has become an enforced assumption in modernity, and is in some ways the table stakes in a modern secular culture, where the only things publicly on the table are supposed to be things that can be empirically demonstrated vis-a-vis science. But a system like any democracy really fudges at that. And this, I think, is some of the panic in the minds of, let's say, Eric Weinstein, some of his urgency in watching, cancel science and science is racist, because that, of course, is the path to truth. And the assumption is, in a modernist culture, that science has a monopoly on truth. But right at the heart of democracy is a contradiction, because democracy attempts to mitigate that by basically saying that moral truths are crowdsourced. If a society wishes to legislate that 2 + 2 = 5, a democracy can do such. And now, hopefully, in a healthy democracy, there's tension between the demands of the people and what can be known through, let's say, the scientific image. And a lot of what we're seeing is a lot of, well, in a modernist frame, propaganda. In a postmodernist frame, crowdsourced moralizing about whether or not there are two sexes, what is constructed and what is deconstructed, whether human beings normally born with vaginas should be called female and human beings normally born with penises should be called male, and whether those observations should be carried on through society and represented in speech and behavior and codes of conduct. Well, this is the crisis we're facing, and in some ways we're right there on the linkage between democracy and truth known by science. Now, I think part of the reason in a modernist framework, and I wrote about this in this chapter that I wrote. I should probably just read some of that or go over that. I don't really have time right now. I haven't had a lot of time to make videos. Sorry about that. Just the church stuff is more and more demanding in that I very much want to continue to be a pastor in real life, of a real life church that keeps me grounded in many ways. Because I think part of the reason Andrew Sullivan gave up blogging and some of the distortions we read in people who are mostly bloggers is that we tend to live in this feeding frenzy of Twitter and YouTube and the internet. And part of what is grounding about in real life relationships are that they're far higher resolution and far more complex, and they don't tend to give themselves to the kind of play that we see happening on social media or in mass media. And I think those are the two terms we should keep using. Mass media. I know when you say mainstream media, it has a political valence, but mass media, that's really what we're talking about. Modernist broadcast media, print, radio, television, and the organs that developed in that space, cable as well, that developed in that space that have now been brought into the granularity of the internet and social media, where everyone can have a voice. Where was I going with that? Oh, I don't want to be a celebrity pastor. I don't want to be an internet pastor. I want to be a pastor in real life. So part of what I was getting to at the end of the previous video, there, I might as well go full screen. Part of what I was getting to at the end of the previous video was the question that I'm wrestling with as a pastor, which is, what does the church look like going forward? Not just living stones. In some ways, COVID is forcing the end of a paradigm that Living Stones grew up in. In some ways, Living Stones, like my father's church, was a racial reconciliation church and was populated by individuals who wanted an alternative to, in my father's church, an alternative to the Dutch CRC congregations. For many of the African Americans, an alternative to the black church, and a question as to whether Dr. King's vision of integration, second wave anti-racism integration, could become a reality. And it did. It did in my father's church. Pastors, a few before me, who's still alive, Earl Marlink here in Sacramento, And so I inherited that. And so here at Little Living Stones, you do have a place where black folks and white folks come together. And again, all of these, it's not really color blindness. We celebrate our diversity. We poke fun at each other sometimes. We're not as different as we seem, but yet we're not the same. And so we explore that together in real life and real community. But the era that birthed this church is passing, and COVID is hurrying it along. And so some of our widows, for example, who might live a ways away, who are getting up there in years, or are having increasing trouble coming to the church, and that'll impact the church. And so, how does a church inhabit this new human space where it's just not meet space in real life gathering together, but it's also doing small groups on Zoom, which we had a new small group start, a men's group that started on Zoom. And myself kind of straddling this with this YouTube channel, just almost every day having more and more private conversations with individuals who, for one reason or another, have had difficulty establishing themselves in real life church homes. Maybe because they live in a place that is isolated, maybe because they are in some ways out of step with their community, maybe because the church landscape continues to change. One of the comments on the Discord server that really caught my attention was many of these individuals who are faithful, loyal members of Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches spend a lot of time listening to a Dutch Reformed preacher. How do we navigate this new world? What are the rules? How do we do it together? So back to the knights and mooks and the internet of beefs. There are principalities and powers, the Bible asserts. The Apostle Paul writes about them. Angels and demons. Oh, what are they? What is it spiritual? What does it mean to be spiritual? What does it mean to be school spirit? What does school spirit mean? How is school spirit formed? You know, my second conversation with Jonathan Pajot really sort of threw me for a loop, because my categories of spirit were quite modernist, and Jonathan Pajot's interesting, ancient, postmodern insights into patterns really added a whole new dimension to spirituality and what does it mean and how does it connect with us. Principalities and powers are agents bigger than ourselves, and again, I think modernism is going away because we can just no longer assert that human beings are the only agents. Part of this is being forced on us by artificial intelligence. There's Slate Star Codec, a blog that I would read occasionally when someone would point me to an article there. A pretty big write-up on them in the New Yorker today that really showed me a little bit more about what that blog was about and where it was from and what's going on with it, and what another tribe of highly intelligent rationalists are playing with just not too many miles from my home in the Bay Area. We are now increasingly forced to publicly confront the fact that there are agents bigger than ourselves, not just individual agents whose voices are amplified by mass media, but in fact an agency that emerges from social media. And you know, with the study of cognitive science that John Vervaeke is doing, and this emergence of agents larger than ourselves that at this point sort of like Sauron and Lord of the Rings are not able to necessarily take on form and shape, but nevertheless have names, and increasingly are named, and are having impacts in terms of politics. You know, to talk about, when Jordan Peterson talked about ideological possession, he just moved us that much closer to the old concept of spiritual possession, in the fact that in non-player characters around us and inside of us, we have a better understanding of possession. We have a better understanding of ourselves being tiny agents in the midst of gods and angels and demons far larger than ourselves, these principalities and powers. There's an agency that communities create. And they are often instantiated in institutions, in churches. And in many ways, a lot of the deconstruction has been of many people has been the weakening of traditional agents with the rise of the individual. But now we are seeing, in a sense, the revenge of the principalities and powers, that these agencies are coming back. We saw them in tyrannical governments in the 20th century, which of course became a near obsession for Jordan Peterson, given his taste in art. Agency of the community, or agency of communities battling each other. They possess people. They have people. Spiritual is the right word for it, but not in the modernistic sense, but in a sense that helps us better understand and, in fact, augment what we understand when the Apostle Paul talks about spiritual principalities and powers. And now churches begin to wonder, can Jesus defeat them? Has Jesus, in fact, marched in triumphal procession, as the Apostle Paul talks about, riffing on the Roman practice of triumphs? Look that up in terms of the Roman context, where the great emperor would march through the city of Rome displaying the trophies of their enemies, but we are post that, says Tom Holland. But yet we have Bloodsport on YouTube, which is, if you again look at the distributists' video about Vaush and Mott and Bailey argumentation, the argument that the distributist basically makes there, I'm never going to get to this video. The argument that the distributist makes there is basically Bloodsport on the internet is Bloodsport. It's the conflict we desire, and I think increasingly it's the conflict we desire and we suck from parasitically in order to gain our identities. Eric Weinstein asked Ross Douthat, I'm finally learning to say their names, asked Ross Douthat if Jesus would just get memed to death. Well, that attempting to meme Jesus away has never ended. I was listening to some late antiquity history recently, and the ways that Augustine and some of his rivals were trying to come to terms with Jesus and what Jesus meant. Yeah, that conflict was They had their own terms, but it was happening there. And so this article, this Internet of Beefs, really grabbed my attention. The mastery of the language grabbed me, of course. I watch people. C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce talks about someone who grumbles all the time, eventually only becoming a grumble. We're seeing that in the Internet of Beefs. We're seeing that in what's happening amongst people today. Now, the whole article is, I have on my blog, Delightful Article of the Month. It's a page that I only occasionally maintain. You can find it in the header on my blog. My blog, you can find it at paulvanderklay.me. The link is, I don't know if I even have a link in the notes usually below, but this Internet of Beefs. Beefing is everywhere on the internet. Bernie and Warren beef with each other, with Trump. Different schools of economists beef with each other over trade policy. Climate hawks beef with climate doves. Here you see Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson taking their beef offline. Where you see Ben Shapiro attempt to bait AOC into a live beef for the 100th time. Is my YouTube channel beefy? Sometimes. Sometimes I'm beefier than I should be. And over on that side, we see Jesse Singal beefing with trans activists. And I look at this list and I think, I know all these people. Oh my goodness, what am I becoming? I used to be naive to this. And in one corner by himself, of course, Nassim Taleb beefing with all comers on all topics. Hulk, smash. Taleb muddying the factional boundaries of the culture war as one of the few genuinely amusing theaters of the conflict on the Internet of Beefs. Blast radius around his Twitter feed is not a safe space for anyone besides members of his own cult of Mesopotamian personality. And this is just the North American English language theater of the Internet of Beefs. The other major one I'm familiar with, the Indian theater, is much worse. Wow. And then he names principalities and powers for me, and sort of in this occultish fashion, there's this sense that once you can get the name of this demon or this god, you can in some way get power over them in the metadivine realm. You can somehow, some way get a handle on them. And now, perhaps more than ever, I have a sense of that power with Mooks and Knights. The most important beefs, though, are not between celebrities at all, but among the anonymous masses who face off under their banners. When I took on Scott Adams' challenge and woke up in the morning and saw, Twitter always has 20 plus notifications. It's like, you can't get any more granular than that, only to realize, what happened to my Twitter feed? Why are all these people insulting me? In many ways, I came into living contact with a significantly sized knight and his army of mooks, and I found it fascinating. Conflict on the Internet of Beefs is not governed by any sort of grand strategy, or even particularly governed by ideological doctrines. It is an unflattened Hobbesian's honor system conflict. Now, a lot of these links go to other things that he's written, like this one, and I found that one interesting too, but no time to talk about it. An unflattened Hobbesian honor society conflict with a feudal structure, at the heart of which is an involuntary, anonymous, fungible, angry figure desperate to be seen as significant, the Mook. Now again, these agents are not just below me, they're in me, but they're also above me. There's an army of them, and together they become a principality or a power. And that'll be clear as we continue to read. The semantic structure of the Internet of Beefs is shaped by high-profile beefs between charismatic celebrity knights, Scott Adams for one, many more. I am one in some ways. Jordan Peterson is one. We have all these different levels of them. Benjamin Boyce, Jonathan Peugeot, Paul Vanderklay has his tiny little army of mooks, perhaps. And I don't want you to be mooks. I want you to be living, breathing human beings, alive. And what reading this makes sense to me is that in many ways it's only the independence and the courage that is afforded by the lordship of Christ that can give me the courage to stand against principalities and powers and say, you may take my job, you may take bread off my table, but I serve a master of one, and although I'm not his best servant, and although sometimes I don't think clearly, and I am not fully devoted or completely resigned to him in all of my ways, because then I would be perfect and know him fully, if there's anyone's mook I'm going to be, well, here's the thing. Read C.S. Lewis' Screwtape Letters. Screwtape tells his nephew, you don't understand, Wormwood. Our Father below wants everyone to be mooks. That one above wants them to be sons, to grow up into his freedom, to be able to know things, to be able to think things, to be image bearers of his freedom, and yet at the same time within his kingdom and loyal and obedient to him. Free slaves. That's what children of God are. Anyway, back to this great piece. The semantic structure of the Internet of Beefs is shaped by high-profile beefs between charismatic celebrity knights loosely affiliated with various citadel-like strongholds peopled by opt-in armies of mooks. The vast majority of the energy of the conflict lies in interchangeable mooks facing off against each other loosely along lines indicated by the knights they follow, the innumerable battles that play out every minute across the Internet of Beefs. They are mooks. They have a name. And they are an army, but they are slaves. Jesus exorcises mooks. Jesus' followers exorcise mooks. Maybe I need a new title. Mook exorcist. Because I don't want mooks. Followers of Jesus are free slaves. Slave and free at the same time. Slave to our master. Free because of who our master is and how he is. Almost none of the batters matter individually. Most mook-on-mook contests are witnessed, for the most part, only by a few friends and algorithms, and merit no overt notice in either Vox or Quillette. Oh, this guy's good. Beyond a local uptick in cortisol levels, individual episodes of mook-on-mook violence are of no consequence. If you're a mook, you're a non-player character, and you don't matter. You are fodder for the knights. Oh, this is good. In aggregate, though, they matter a lot. Like pawns. They are the reason for being for the Internet of Beefs. A standard pattern of conflict in the Internet of Beefs is depressingly predictable. A mook takes note of a casus belli in the news cycle. Trolls are perhaps a level up from mooks. They're mooks with a little bit more intelligence, maybe to one day become a knight, maybe to establish a cult. A casus belli in the news cycle, often created or co-opted by a knight. A referral to on the Internet of Beefs is as the outrage. and referred to on the Internet of Beefs as the outrage cycle, and heads over to their favorite multiplayer online battle arena, Twitter being the most important multiplayer online battle arena, to join known Mook allies to fight stereotypically familiar but often unknown interchangeable Mook foes. They come prepared either to melee within the core or skirmish on the periphery, either rallying around the knights riding under known beef-only banners or adventuring by themselves in unflagged, unheralded side battles. It's where they have their identity. There's no higher honor for a Mook than to be noticed by the knights they fight for. As a result, the fealty of the Mook is the currency of the manorial economy of the Internet of Beefs. Mook coins are mined by knights through the act of Senpai Notice Me. And again, this guy, I didn't know a bunch of this stuff, but right there it is. What does Notice Me, Senpai, if I'm saying it right, mean? I hope Senpai will notice me is a phrase. Oh, darn internet ads. Senpai, sometimes spelled senpai, is an honorific to an upper class at school. In anime and manga, it is a common trope that senpai character is often an object of affection for a younger peer. The phrase, I hope senpai will notice me, or more commonly, I hope senpai notices me, is mostly associated with Tumblr. The concept of senpai, previously been discussed on the site as Tumblr, well, basically, you get it. Notice me, knight, notice me. Maybe I'll be able to be elevated and become a knight myself. First, if I'm loyal to the knight. And again, I say Jesus doesn't want mooks. Jesus wants sons. And daughters, but I'm using the ancient conceptualization. Call it proof of favor, and on Mookcoin runs the economy of the Internet of Beefs. A Mook once animated by a grievance is hard to destroy. Loyalties might shift through nightly sellouts and betrayals. Why? Why are we so fascinated with Christian rock band or Christian celebrities who defect? They're knights who are switching sides. Oh, the Mook armies will rally and be and you know what they do. Loyalties might shift through nightly sellouts and betrayals, and Mook allegiances through shift individually and en masse in ideologically incoherent ways. But once the psyche of a Mook becomes animated by grievance power, there is no going back. It is almost irreversible sort of dehumanization. And some of the knights you see are this way, or at least they play it on the internet. You know, some of the most interesting comments coming out of Eric Weinstein in his most recent conversation with David Fuller were about, sometimes Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens, and, well, go find them on the left because they're all over the place too. They're ideologically possessed. Now, you might like it if they agree with your ideology, and maybe I'm being unkind to Ben Shapiro. I haven't listened to him that much, and I know some people enjoyed the latest book that he wrote. And and just as Eric Weinstein noted in that interview, he counts Ben Shapiro a friend, and so does Sam Harris. But the character that Shapiro plays on TV, or on the little TV of YouTube, well, maybe I'm being unfair. And if I am, blast away, Mooks. I'm not afraid of it. I've been set free, mostly, because we're going to find out the bondage of the knights. The more Mooks a knight in the Internet of Beefs can maintain in a stable state of combat readiness, the bigger a player they are on the Internet of Beefs. I remember Jordan Peterson in that one moment right after the interview with Kathy Newman, says, I could unleash, doesn't use these words, but this is what he says, I could unleash my mooks at you, and many mooks will go and fight his battle. And in fact, this is part of the energy that propelled Jordan Peterson to the top, and I would argue probably in conjunction, obviously, with the significant health issues of himself and his wife, took him out of the game for so long, because this isn't cost-free for a knight who wants nuance, for a knight who, and again, Jordan's not perfect, but especially before things got too far in some ways, and more of his talks were nightly, nightish. And times that I saw him live, I was more disturbed by the fact that Dave Rubin got the crowd going, and the crowd was there for the mookish delights. And that was very different from the Jordan that I see in the biblical series and in his Maps of Meaning lectures to the classroom, and his personality lectures. And the mooks mob up and take over the night. So, and that's why mooks have a spirit, and it's a possession. It's something higher than the mooks. But together the mooks make a principality and a power. And even take over the night. And this is something that I had a questioning tweet the other day about some men standing before their Roman Catholic Church, proudly displaying their guns. And I asked the question, would Jesus want you to shoot someone to protect the building? Because the church isn't the building. And this is where there's a lot of Protestantism in this conversation that I won't have time to fully bring out here, because I haven't thought it through, because this is all quite new to me. But these monologue videos for me are, I don't know why these things pop up. These monologue videos for me are thinking out loud. The more mooks a knight of the Internet of Beefs can maintain in a stable state of combat readiness, the bigger a player they are in the Internet of Beefs. If you are blessed with a better, beefier class of mook in your army, capable of sustaining and dishing out more damage points, they will even win over more mooks from adjacent theaters of conflict for you, and perhaps even bait a few frustrated non-combatants. Not the same non-player characters, who are in fact a class of combatant present on all sides, into joining the conflict. To the seasoned knight, it doesn't matter whether a new mook joins on their side or the other side. The point is to grow and sustain the conflict rather than win. More on the latter. To be a knight, of course, is to have a recognized name, to have that blue check behind you in Twitter. The female Captain Marvel jumped on YouTube. Bang! Instant knight. To be a knight, of course, is to have a recognized name, a storied reputation as a beef-only thinker to be reckoned with. Why did Jordan Peterson leap with that Kathy Newman interview? It was beefy, baby. One capable of owning opposed knights and absolutely eviscerating them in strategically edited YouTube clips. All the clip channels of Jordan Peterson destroying. Knights might be affiliated with known imperial banner, or less frequently freelancers like Talib. The term freelancer comes from mercenary knights with no fixed loyalty in the medieval era. Language carries consciousness. The centrality of Mooks is an important point that is often overlooked, often by Knights and Mooks themselves, because of the obvious insignificance of any particular Mook in isolation. In aggregate, however, Mook power is what the Internet of Beefs is about. It is relatively peaceful. If the relatively peaceful web of the 90s and the aughts was about civilian eyeballs, that was mass media trying to get a handle on things, the Internet of Beefs is about Mook on Mook combat clicks and is now entering its second decade. Searing 20s is the eyeball roasting name I've entered into the naming contest. The technology of the Internet of Beefs is the technology of pitting crowds of Mooks against one another. Conflict on the Internet of Beefs is shaped not by the strategic intentions of its nominal leaders, who largely have none, beyond keeping the conflict profitably alive and growing. Why won't Twitter and Facebook and YouTube get rid of all of those racists? Well, of course. What do you mean by racists? Do you mean anybody who doesn't agree with the current ascendant morality? Because YouTube isn't dumb. They might knock off Stefan Molyneux. They Patreon might get rid of Sargon of Akkad, but they know where their bread is buttered. They know what game they're in. If they're a publicly traded company, their primary duty is to the stockholder. Now suddenly, remember I talked about that tension between the morality of democracy and the scientific image? Well, there it is. Go woke, go broke. Because it's not the purity, although purity is what drives this mookish game. It's not the purity that is it is about. It's about the conflict. It's if YouTube, the algorithm knows how to push our buttons and how to move our glands. The best Knights on the Internet of Beef, such as Trump, and he is, when you look at, sometimes I look at politically, why are you doing what you're doing? And this is the best explanation I've seen for some of the things that Trump has done. The best Knights on the Internet of Beef, such as Trump, operate by an entirely reactive philosophy. There go my mooks. I must find out where they are going so I can get out in front of them and lead. And this is what I most fear about my presence on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook very much. I just can't stand it. This is what I most fear about my presence on YouTube and my propensity. Pastors have a common weakness for people pleasing, quivering masses of availability. And that's always at tension in any therapeutic situation. But I must follow my audience because why? Well, this is why I don't want to become a celebrity pastor, because pastors are already in some ways captives to the Protestant clergy, especially captives to their audience. I don't want to be captive to an army of mooks. Then I am possessed by a principality and the power that my particular mook horde embodies. The best Knights on the Internet of Beef, such as Trump, there go my mooks. I must find out where they are going so I can get out in front of them and lead them. Actual belief is a liability in the Internet of Beefs. The more a Knight or an Internet of Beef Knight of the Internet of Beefs genuinely believes in whatever principle they think they are fighting for, the less effective they are as wranglers of a fickle mood energy, Read the Christian Gospels. Jesus dealt with the mooks. In the Gospel of Matthew, they're the crowd, as is often translated in English, the oxlos. They're the crowd, and Jesus would not be captive to his mooks. He didn't want them to be mooks. And so at one point he says, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you can have no part of me. And this was a defining moment for the disciples. Will you be mooks or will you be disciples? And Karen and Michael on the Meaning Code channel, again, had just a tremendous conversation recently. And Karen brought up how again and again the disciples are trying to be mooks. They're trying to peg Jesus as, are you the Messiah? But when they ask him this question, they're saying, are you this little cartoon character that I can predict? And that's the one I want to follow. Please be our knight. I'll be your loyal mook. And Jesus won't let them be mooks. So he keeps frustrating them and disturbing their picture of him. That's why he calls himself the Son of Man. He takes this piece of Daniel 7 and says, here I am. And they're like, well, if you're that, then, and they keep trying to turn him into a knight. And Jesus says, I will not be your knight. And at one point they want to make him king, the crowd, and Jesus goes through the crowd. Other times they want to kill him. Well, that's what the mook, the oxlon, the mooks, that's what that principality does. And Jesus says, not me. I'll be crucified alone with those aspiring to be more than mooks, the disciples, cowering in some rented room, and only the women and young like John daring to be in the crowd of other mooks who are playing their parts for the knights in their presence. Jesus leads in triumphal procession the principalities and powers of knights and mooks, and he will not be reduced to a meme. Go ahead and memeify him. Make jokes, but he's still around today. Caesar isn't. The more a knight of the Internet of Beefs genuinely believes in whatever principle they think they are fighting for, the less effective they are as wranglers of fickle mook energy. Sincerely ideological players routinely overestimate the depth of intellectual coherence required to accumulate and wield mook power, producing nerdy intellectual edifices where mere confetti gestures would not just do the job, but actually do it better. In other words, yes, you can play the role and you can learn the role, and that role can possess you. And if you stray from that role, that mook horde that you have accumulated will turn on you. Hosanna, Hosanna, crucify, crucify. The best knights of the Internet of Beefs carry on their beef-only cultural conflicts only because the mooks make it profitable for them to do so. Patreon. For the mook, the conflict is a means to an end, however incoherent. What end is the mook looking for? Well, maybe to become a knight. They're deriving their identity from the agent-arena relationship. For the knight, the conflict is the end. And how many situations in American politics? I've long thought that abortion for the right has become like this. If Roe v. Wade gets overturned, well, what won't the right fight about? LGBT is now that for the left, and my terror is that race is becoming the conflict that can never end. Because once that happens, well, then we're back. We're back in the kind of the principalities and powers of American slavery, and the Jim Crow South will reign again. I don't want that to happen. For the Knight, the conflict is the end. Growing it, keeping it going, is something like an entrepreneurial cultural capital business model. One with no exit from hell market of other people. Sartre would be proud. Why did the March of Dimes keep going? Why, once we establish an institution of principality and power, we must go and find racism so that our anti-racist crusade can continue? And it doesn't mean that there isn't racism, but you have established an identity as a knight, and you need to keep the mooks fed, or the mooks will turn on you. If conflict in any particular theater shows dangerous signs of actually resolving itself, another must be spun up to take its place, much as businesses that hope to survive must replace markets and decline with new ones. As a result, on the Internet of Beefs, the only meaningful transaction is the pitched battle between armies of mooks, the equivalent of a viral hit. The bloodier and stupider, the better to the instigating monks on all sides. The greater the futility, the more useful, since it reinforces a disposition towards conflict for the sake of conflict. Strategy is not just absent, it's an outright liability, since it might encourage negotiation and compromise. Lower the social death body count of faceless mooks, inhibit GDP growth in the mook manorial economy, and worst of all, potentially end the conflict. A common posture among the knights of the Internet of Beefs, one that is more often clueless than disingenuous, is that the mooks are not important. That the knights are neither responsible for what the mooks do, nor accountable for the views held by mooks who fight under their banners. Oh, if you're a knight, that's what you have to deal with all the time. That the existence of mooks is merely a sort of unfortunate and unavoidable natural side effect rather than the whole point. And this again is where principalities and powers are important, because in a modernist system you must blame the knight, but you don't understand that knight and mook alike are tools of agents above and beyond themselves. Agents that they've had a part in summoning. But now that agent is here, and who will release them? Who can release them from the power of that agent? What will be the path? The path looks like mortification. It looks like conversion. It looks like taking up your cross and becoming the victim of your mooks. That the work of mining more mooks through senpai notice me marks of favor is innocent noblesse oblige towards an oppressed population that one reluctantly leads, rather than a profitable grievance mine that one lives off of. I'm terrified of this. That the excesses of one's own mooks are both overstated and forgivable as crimes of temporary, misguided, and justified exuberance, while those of the other side's mooks embody the spiritual, if not biological, end of humanity. Just because we had the protests, that mob isn't our fault. You summoned the looters. How do you summon the looters? Do you make a pentagram? Do you find Eye of Newt? Do you have magic words? Oh, we have magic words. Owen Benjamin was right. We have magic words, and they summon principalities and powers, and they possess people. And we become knights and mooks of the principalities and powers. They are engaged in high-minded cultural battles for the soul of society against dishonorable opposition, fatally compromised by bad faith, while themselves only reluctantly entering the battlefield out of a sense of duty and bound by the code of reasonable, unbiased, balanced conduct, even if it means nobly marching to martyrdom. I call this posture mook manorialism. The posture is similar to, and indeed overlaps with, the posture of revolutionary leaders who instigate what has come to be known as stochastic terrorism. The difference is that the Lord of Mook Manor maintains a sanitary ideological distance from his Mooks while keeping them tactically close on the Internet of Beefs, close enough to hear dog whistles and to take tactical clues from their own marquee jousts, distant enough from plausible ideological deniability. Unlike the leaders of ISIS, Internet of Beef Knights are not particularly eager to take responsibility for terror attacks under their banners, only to profit from their consequences. Again, be ye not mooks. The master that you follow will determine whether or not you are a mook. Mook memorialism is an economy based on axe grinding. As the peasantry, mooks do more than fight other mooks. They are also responsible for keeping grievances large and small, well-nursed and alive. Occasionally, through an act like whistleblowing or leaking of a confidential communications, a mook might briefly become a named player in a particular theater of conflict, but the medium mook is primarily expected to keep everyday grievances alive and fight under the glare of algorithmic lights when called upon to do so. Unrecognized by history, but counted on the statistics and noticed by the senpais, the AIs. I remember a meeting that was, someone wanted to lead this meeting as an anti-racist thing. And so they brought in some examples of people of color. And they were there to give testimony to the racism that they were subject with. But these were high school kids. And so when asked, and this was a little before a lot of this, tell me about are you a victim of racism in your school? And these children of color said, no. They'd obviously been uninitiated. They're not mooks yet, but they soon will be. Importantly, unless you do something dumb that makes you vulnerable to being drawn into the mook manorial economy against your will, that happens, such as saying something that can be used against you while in a position of authority or in an important institution, the Internet of Beefs is an opt-in conflict arena. Not anymore. It's coming out of the Internet and into real life. If only opt-in to the Internet of Beefs, driven by sincere grievance, if you are mook enough to want to. If you aren't, you haven't fallen into the Internet of Beefs by becoming vulnerable or compromised in some way. You are there either because you've been baited in or because you are profiting from its existence. Among the most grimly amusing aspects of the Internet of Beefs is that the endemic conflict unfolding endlessly and pointlessly on it is called a culture war. So what exactly is cultural about the culture war? The nominal bones of contention, such as representation in movies or statues of the Western canon or Enlightenment values in higher education, appear to simply be convenient recruitment hooks that conform to fairly obvious ways to mook identities. The culture wars are no more identitarian and cultural by virtue of the context than any other war, as far as I can tell, and certainly beefing on the Internet of Beefs does little to satisfy settled questions of identity one or another. No, it becomes the identity. It becomes the identity. A beef is ritualized, extended conflict between named, evenly matched combatants who each stand for marquee ideological positions and, most importantly, reciprocate each other's hostile feelings in active, engaged ways. A beef is something like an evil twin of a love affair. A beef must be conducted with visible skill and honor, though codes of honor may be different on the different sides and in public view. Each combatant must be viewed by his or her own supporters as having picked a worthy adversary. Otherwise, the contest means nothing. The combatants fight. Now, you see this in the atheism-Christian debates too, right? Right? There's a piece of Protestantism in this thing, okay? And there's a piece of confessionality in this thing where I'm Dutch Reformed, I'm Roman Catholic, I'm Orthodox. This game has been played a long time, but the internet is like gasoline on a fire. The internet of beef's beef is not mere trash-talking people who are obviously friends, accompanied by laughter and signs of affection. Whether real or staged, a beef must present the appearance of a genuine conflict to the Mook audience. Umbrage must be taken and seen to be taken. Insults must be hurled. The venom must seem real. The mutual dislike must be palatable. That's where the energy comes from. It was Ghostbusters, right? One of the originals where there's all this current of hate and animosity, and that was sort of before New York City really got sanitized and gentrified, and everybody need to love each other, and that was going to fix the slime, right? Very archetypal story. What separates the knight from the mook? Of course, it's not a nerdy literacy in a particular beef only discourse, but a capacity for a profitable originality within it. The mark of a knight, of the vast round table of the internet of beefs, is the relentless pursuit of the holy grift, capital H, capital G, a mercantile mission for the end of history. This is not a novel observation. Every non-combatant observer of the culture wars appears to have arrived at this conclusion, and many prominent knights have admitted it in private. The sign of a core economy of profiteering and carpetbagging are just too unmistakable. This does not mean that there isn't a core of actual missionary sentiment driving most knights. It just means, push come to shove, that the grifting motive will rule behavior rather than ideological ends. Are you willing to crush your mooks? If you get too many mooks, are you then their prisoner? The grifter keeps the culture war going, but did they create it? This might be the most basic political question of our times. I believe the answer is no. Principalities and powers. A basic mistake made by many watchers of the culture war is to assume that grifter knights did in fact create the mook manorial economy that sustains them. That is not only being sustained top down, but is in fact created bottom up by design. Agency emerging. The story goes, state actors, media empires, and technology platforms enable the Internet of Beef's infrastructure level as an economic sector. The knights of the Internet of Beefs, whether missionary axe grinders, mercenary freelancers, or something in between, use that infrastructure skillfully to downgrade innocent humans into mooks and keep them profitably angry and fighting. This is so Screw Tape Letters. While the mooks fight, the knights make money. While the knights make money, state actors and technology companies reshape the map of the world to rule it better. It is a tempting theory. There are even stylized patterns of conflict that suggest such a top-down designed order beneath the chaos of the conflict. There is brinkmanship of cancel culture. There is the incessant battling of civil debate culture. There is the presence of supposedly addictive UX patterns. There are powerful state cyber agencies, and elsewhere all around there is a constant, exhausting cosmic background radiation of relentless, sleepless, sightless panic mockery of the outgroup led by the nightly class. It is tempting to believe that this is a world in which your average mook has no agency. Tempting but wrong. It is a theory that flatters the conceit of the nightly class and state actors that they, rather than the zombie mooks, are in fact in charge. But who's in charge of the mooks? It's the principalities and powers. They're possessed. We know crowds get possessed. Now we can crowd in a new space, a new cyberspace that we've created. It's old. Jesus dealt with the mooks in Galilee. Mooks believe this too, because it is pleasant conspiracy theory that lets them off the hook. Regular human beings are naturally nice and peaceable, and evil powers that dehumanize them into zombie mook armies through their evil Bond villain X machinations. And the only reason they are fighting on side X is because the worst of the Bond villains are on the other side. We can't let them get away with it. We wouldn't stoop to these dirty measures if it weren't necessary. Sometimes you need to break some eggs. And as Orwell said, then show me the omelet. Sadly, this is a mere self-congratulation by self-important knights and mooks. If it were that simple, a round of tasteful guillotining would achieve peacemaking miracles, liberate the mooks, raise their consciousness, produce a kind of utopian yellow-jacketed France, and produce the kind of utopia yellow-jacketed France is not. State and non-state actors act to enable the Internet of Beefs because the existence of knights makes it valuable to do so. Why? You can get elected. Why do the politicians show up on the late night talk shows? Why do the politicians want to get the endorsement of Joe Rogan? The knights exist profitably because the mooks enable them to do so. The Internet of Beef is an economy of opportunity created by the human condition at the end of history. It is a consequence rather than a cause. It's all about the mooks. It's all about being. It's always been about the mooks, about the economic and political opportunities presented by the curse of downcycled human resources available from one last long harvest before the machine butlers replace them. To mint a mook is not an act against history, just a gentle nudge to accelerate that almost inevitable outcome. So the question really is, where did the mooks come from? A speculative answer I'm working on takes the theories of Francis Fukuyama to a conclusion he himself has been reluctant to take them lately. The mooks were born of the end of history. As zombie last persons, pale shadows of dead archetypes drawn from many imagined histories. Histories that are all 30 years past their terminus. Now we're knocking on Ross Douthat's door. That then is the mook, the last person fighting soullessly over the right to perpetuate a dead identity as a Mary Sue protagonist of unbearably bad fan fictions of nothingness. Wow. Events even seemed historic. Events continuing to happen does not mean history is continuing past its end. I am convinced, even as Fukuyama himself, come at me, bro, walks back his theories, that history did in fact end with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the emergence of vast mook classes around the world is a natural consequence. History ends not when the stream of apparent historic events ends, but when the world loses a sense of a continuing narrative and arrives at what psychologists call a sense of foreshortened future. Colin Wright today on Twitter tweets this: every day I see more and more evidence every day I see more and more evidence like this that convinces me Nick Bostrom was right. We are living in a simulation. It's like SimCity, or Civilization, the computer game. Everyone knows that once you build a successful society, the game gets boring, and so you turn disasters up to maximum to watch it all burn. It's Dostoevsky. Give them everything they need, and they'll destroy the machine. It's the utopia created for mice, and it collapses. What happened in 1989? What did the Matrix say? What happened in 1989, even if it took nearly 30 years for everyone to get the memo and get very online to beef about it, leaving lonely billionaires dreaming of space colonies peopled and roboted, but a less disheartened post-historical transhuman species? The rise of the Internet of Beefs as a direct consequence of the end of history presents a difficult challenge for those of us who haven't been entirely mookified yet and aren't billionaire enough, that FU money, enough to dream of living on Mars, served by identity-less robots. Or FU money enough to be a member of the IDW and speak your mind. But are Eric and Brett accumulating Mooks? That's why I drop by their server sometime, the Portal server, because I want to know, are these Mooks or are these people? Because the only way to end the endless Hobbesian war of all against all at the end of history is to reboot history. Eschatology. Why on earth did apocalyptic literature thrive when it did? This is not a trivial undertaking. It is not a matter of teaching the uncouth mook some civility. It is not about beefing knights, debating with civility, and arriving at a new imaginative consciousness, understanding, or even a harmonious dissensus understanding of the human condition, and announcing an armistice to the grateful and exhausted mooks. It is not about a return or a broad-based prosperity driven by the reversal of climate change. This is game B for Brett Weinstein. The promise of space exploration, nanotechnology, quantum computing, CRISPR. It is not about contrite robber baron oligarchs suddenly growing a conscience. Isn't that the demand of Black Lives Matter and the woke religion? If only the robber barons. Is Tim Cook insufficiently woke? It's not about contrite robber baron oligarchs suddenly growing a conscience thanks to the sermonizing and shaming of ethicists and designing more humane technologies in their neoliberal capitalist platforms. And it's not about guillotines, universal basic income, progressive taxation, free college, or debt jubilees. Again, if you've got a beef with history, tell me what can make up for the genocide of the inhabitants in the Americas, those immigrants prior to the European immigrant. Tell me what can make up, what can make amends, what price can be paid to pay the debt for American slavery. And those are just the tip of the iceberg of the pains of planet Earth. It would have to be a sacrifice of infinite value. But where could you find such a sacrifice? And it would have to be freely given. If it was coerced or taken from someone, you would just add to the pile of tyranny in history. It would have to be an infinite sacrifice freely given for the sake of all human sins. Where have I heard something like that? How about every time when I serve communion? This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you, for the forgiveness of sins. We are beefing because we no longer know who we are. Each of us individually and collectively as a species. Knight and Mook alike are faced with a terrifying possibility that if there is no history in the future, there is nobody in particular to be once the beefing stops. In other words, yes, it's the agent-arena relationship. The soldier only has identity because of the arena, which is the war. The citizen has identity because the arena is a peaceful, lawful situation. The Mook does his or her bidding, and the Knight does the bidding of the Mook, and the Mook does the bidding of the Knight, because they are caught in the agent-arena relationship. They have derived their identity from it, and if it goes away, they will just go looking for a new one, because they are not whole. They have no self. You cannot achieve an identity. That is the basis, that is the premise of the modern world. Identity must be received, not achieved, and it must be received by the arena. Well, can an arena bestow an identity if the arena is agentic? If the arena itself also has agency? And if that agency, well, what kind of arena? Well, and the only way to reboot history is to figure out us? Us figure this out? Have we not paid attention to the fact that we're being possessed by spirits, that we're non-player characters, and that we're summoning them too? Is to figure out new beings to be. This dynamic won't repeat. Because that's ultimately what beefing is about. A way to avoid being. She was a grumble until all that was left was the grumble. A way to avoid being without allowing time itself to end. The end of history is why beef-only thinking is a crash-only thinking by human beings. The Internet of Beefs is a way of shorting our collective humanity, and crashing all ways of being entirely with no promise of recovery or reboot. I've held off on doing, I haven't checked lately, I've held off on the conclusion of The Good Place. But there it is. Go watch Amazon's Upload. There it is. To participate is to lose. But building and maintaining increasingly costly defenses in the form of progressively thickening skin and strengthening force fields of passive-aggressive resistance is also unsustainable. There is no exit. It is a no-exit, hellish condition. Read the whole thing. Uncle Screwtape writes to Nephew Wormwood, "To us, a human is primarily food. Mooks are food for knights, but their god is their stomach. To us, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. But the obedience which the enemy demands," that's our divine enemy, who threatens us, who it's better to believe there is no God, because once you believe it, you have to worry what's on his mind and worry what he thinks about you. For which the enemy above demands of men is quite a different thing. Again, with Screwtape, you always have to read the stuff inverted. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, capital H. Creatures whose life, on its miniature scale, will be qualitatively like his own, not because he has absorbed them, or because their wills freely conform to his. What does Jesus say in the Gospel of John? I call you my friends. God is looking for friends. What does it mean to be a friend of God? I often note when people ask me, I had a question in the question and answer about minimum Christianity, minimum system requirements. And there are two modes in the New Testament of ongoing communion with God. One is about what we did and didn't do, and the other is where we stand in relationship to Him. Depart from me, I never knew you, He says. He wants our lives to be qualitatively like His own. We, the demons, want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim in a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into Himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. I don't stop being me. I don't stop being me. Christianity believes not in our absorption into some great sea of being, but that my individuality will continue. And yes, I'll be part of a principality, will be part of our Lord. We're in Christ, we're part of the body of Christ, but the particularity that is Paul Vanderklay will continue, perfected, becoming, yet unique. That is Christian hope. Now, Mookism will remain as long as this present age remains. And so again, I say, if you're like my stuff and follow my channel, don't be a mook. I don't want mooks. I want friends. Now, can I be friend of 1,000 or 2,000 people? No, that Dunbar number of 200 still holds, and I regret that. But my Lord has no such limitation. And His Spirit has no such Dunbar number. And what He wants for you is freedom, the kind of freedom He enjoys. Not mooks and knights, but servants that become sons. That's why I'm a Christian. And I hope my channel is received in that spirit.